In this video, we'll discuss Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy in order to determine what, if any, wisdom we can gain from there. Similarly to the way in which we discussed Abraham's origin story, the Buddha also begins his spiritual journey with an action most people would rightfully consider unethical. He walks out on his wife and young children. The person who will become the Buddha is named Siddhartha Gautama. And at the age of 30, after living the life of a prince, he leaves his family in order to attempt to gain spiritual insight and wisdom. One day, this prince had snuck outside of the palace walls and saw what are called the four sights. He saw a person begging and suffering in poverty. He saw a person diseased and suffering with ill health. He saw a funeral procession and a family suffering at the death of a loved one. And finally, he saw a wandering monk. And he decides, after living this pampered life of luxury, that he doesn't understand what life is really about. And so, he leaves to attempt to discover the answer to that question. At first, the Buddha undertakes the path of extreme asceticism. We had defined asceticism as depriving oneself of physical pleasures for a spiritual purpose. And so, the Buddha, instead of taking at first a path of moderation, takes the path of extremism, fasting or eating as little food as possible in order to gain spiritual insight. According to tradition, the Buddha, before he becomes the Buddha, survives on as little as 1 grain of rice a month. And after a short period of time of starving himself for spiritual wisdom, Siddhartha Gautama realizes he's at death's door, but is no closer to achieving enlightenment. He's literally killing himself. This asceticism, this radical and extreme self-deprivation, is destroying his life. And so, he abandons this path, and instead develops a philosophy of moderation and the middle way. That extreme self-denial is not the path to the divine, to ethics, or to holiness, and instead, balance and harmony are. And he declares what are called 4 noble truths. Let us determine whether we think these truths are indeed true. The first of the 4 noble truths is that life is suffering, which is not to say that all life is all suffering all the time, but rather that all life involves at least some suffering. In my classroom lectures, I usually ask students to raise their hands if they've never experienced any pain, displeasure, discomfort, or suffering. As you might imagine, there's never been a single person to live that charmed of a life, as I would expect is true for you too. What about the second of the four so-called noble truths? Buddha's claim that suffering comes from desire or attachment. Imagine if you have a nice car parked in the parking lot at a grocery store, and you come outside, and instead of your nice, fresh, new, clean, shiny paint job, someone has bumped into your car and left a great big dent or a scratch or keyed up the doors. How would you feel? Many of my students report that they would feel angry. The reason why you feel anger is because you have desire or attachment to that material possession. You want it to stay nice. If your car is parked next to my car in the parking lot, and my car is all keyed up, you don't really feel bad because you have no desire, you have no attachment to that object. You might say, glad I'm not that guy, but that's about it. We also have desire and attachment to other people, and this is why when a relationship ends or a loved one dies, we feel suffering because we have desire to be with them. We have attachment to them. Another important Buddhist concept is that of impermanence. The idea that nothing lasts, all things pass away. This helps us understand the third of the Four Noble Truths, that ending desire or attachment, that is to say, practicing detachment, ends suffering. This doesn't mean that if one doesn't want to feel pain when your mother passes away, you shouldn't love your mother. But instead, that there should be, or it's wise to have, a recognition that all things pass. Nice cars get dinged up, get old, and fall apart. People come and go, both in romantic relationships and in family ones. Even we ourselves are impermanent. We might have desire to live forever, but for Buddhism, that is both irrational and inappropriate, simply unwise. Even we ourselves are impermanent. And if we can recognize and understand or be accepting of that impermanence, we can begin to decrease the death grip we have on life, on our family and friends, on each other, and begin to ease and ultimately end, to the extent that we are able, suffering. We discussed in the last video the idea that out of fear of death, people can be motivated to kill others to protect themselves, as if we ourselves are permanent. Our attachments to others, even to our own lives, if not checked, held in moderation, and properly understood in context, can become a cause for suffering for others. As much as I wish that I could elaborate explicitly all the varieties of life circumstances and ethical wisdom this would touch upon, in this online format, I'll leave that for you. Simply, I'll end the third noble truth by also identifying that often we create attachments to our expectations. We expect things to happen in one way, and then when our expectations are frustrated, we become upset. The future is also uncertain and impermanent. If you're looking forward to going out with your friends on a Friday night, and then plans fall through, or banking on a certain college to make all your dreams come true, and you don't get accepted, those attachments to expectations can be a cause of suffering. So the Buddhist philosophical wisdom is to hold those expectations in moderation and to understand that to the extent that we're attached to them is the extent to which we are likely exposing ourselves to unnecessary suffering. The fourth of the four noble truths is that there's a way out of suffering and a way out of attachment, which is essentially to practice Buddhist philosophy and religion. Buddhism lays out what's called an Eightfold Path, an 8-step program to ending attachment and thus ending suffering, thereby attaining liberation and enlightenment. The very first step on this path is ahimsa, or nonviolence. Buddhism is very literally an evolution of Hinduism. It evolves from Hinduism. And so, there are considerable overlaps or developments from Hindu religious philosophy into Buddhist religious philosophy. The question is, can we gain some wisdom from this so-called wisdom tradition? The second step on the path in the original language would be aparigraha, which means non-hoarding or non-coveting or non-consumerism, non-materialism, non-greed. That if attachment is the cause of suffering, then in order to decrease this suffering, we must decrease our attachments. For that reason, if we define materialism as the idea that a good life is achieved through fine material possessions, Buddhism is anti-materialistic, probably to that same extent also anti-consumeristic or anti-consumerism, perhaps even anti-capitalist. But that may or may not be a bridge too far in terms of Buddhist philosophy. I'll give you just a moment to look at this slide. And I'll end, unfortunately very quickly, with this pleasant story about the moment at which the Buddha attains enlightenment. What you see in front of you is the great demon of illusion, Mara. And he's holding on to the wheel of life and death, of birth and reincarnation. This is called samsara. And much like Jesus' temptation by the devil, Mara asks, "By what right do you, Buddha, think you're worthy of attaining enlightenment, nirvana?" And what the Buddha does is he reaches down and touches the earth at the foot of the Bodhi tree where he had been meditating. And he says, "The earth is my witness. The earth vouches for me." I especially like this story, not for any grand philosophical reason, but rather because the earth itself is the gatekeeper to divine insight. The Greeks have Gaia, the Egyptians, Geb, the Hawaiians, Pele, the volcano spirit. For many religions around the world, the earth is sacred. It's not just stuff. It's the most important entity in existence, without which we could do nothing. Buddhism and many religions credit this. And so I'll leave you to contemplate the moral significance of the planet that many think we own, but perhaps may more truthfully own us.